A cowboy saved Apache woman from drowning. Now her tribe says she belongs to him by sacred law. The year was 1878. On the high plains of Arizona Territory, where the canyon walls met the swollen banks of the Gila River, the wind howled thin and sharp, dragging the night's chill into the bones o' morning. Dust clung to dry grass, and the earth was still cracked from last summer's drought, though the rains of 3 days past had swollen the river beyond its banks. Samuel Hartley rode slowly along the south fence line, one hand on the reins, the other resting on his thigh. A scarred knee beneath his worn trousers ached with every step his horse took. 43 years old, a former Union cavalryman, Samuel had long since traded rifles for ranching tools, though the war had never quite let him go. He'd returned from the battlefield with a shattered leg, a folded burial flag in his satchel, and no family left to welcome him home. Since then, he'd kept to himself, tending cattle on land granted by the Homestead Act, land no one else had wanted. A leather-bound Bible sat untouched on a shelf in his cabin. Dust lay thick across its cover.
As he dismounted near a bend in the river, Samuel heard it. Sudden, wrong, a heavy splash that wasn't driftwood or bird. His head snapped up. Water moved quick and rough below, but something else shifted through the current. There, an arm. A dark shape rolled just beneath the surface. He didn't think. He ran. Boots slammed against the muddy bank, bad legs screaming in protest. He dove into the cold water, the shock hitting his chest like a rifle butt. His arms cut through the current, pushing hard toward the struggling shape. It was a woman. He caught her under the arms, kicked backward, and dragged them both toward the bank. Her skin was cold as stone. Her dress, once deerskin, was torn and soaked. Long black hair plastered across her face. She didn't move. Samuel coughed hard, knelt over her, listening for breath. There, faint, shallow. She was alive. He didn't wait. He wrapped her in his coat, lifted her into his arms, and started back toward the cabin tucked beneath 2 pine trees. Step by step, each one a test of will, he carried the weight of her body, and something heavier he couldn't name. He saved her without a word. But what happens when 2 wounded hearts begin to share the same silence? Stay with us, because this story is only just beginning to breathe. The fire crackled low and steady as Samuel knelt beside it with practiced hands. He hadn't needed to build a blaze for anyone but himself in years, but tonight his hands moved differently, quicker, with purpose. The girl lay silent on the cot behind him, barely breathing, her skin still pale beneath the borrowed blanket he'd wrapped around her. Her clothes were soaked and torn, clinging to her like the river hadn't quite let go. He hadn't stripped her bare, just enough to free her from the water's weight. Modesty wasn't taught to soldiers, but something in the curve of her shoulders, the way her fingers had curled even in unconsciousness, made him careful. He found an old shirt of his, clean, faded, and placed it beside her. If she woke, it would be her choice. He'd done enough choosing for one day. Outside, wind howled through the branches. Inside, the room held its breath. Samuel stood and poured water into a tin cup. He placed it on the table closest to her, then dragged the worn rocking chair to the wall and sat down. His knee throbbed with each shift, a pain so old he no longer cursed it. He'd gotten used to the ache, just like he'd gotten used to silence. But this silence was different. This wasn't the kind that settled after years of being alone. This was the kind that hummed with presence. Another breath in the room, another heartbeat. He didn't sleep, not really, dozed maybe. Eyes half closed, boots still on, hat tipped over his brow. Just enough rest to keep watch. Once, sometime past midnight, she stirred. Her lips parted in a whisper too faint to understand.
Her brows drew together, and she turned toward the fire. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. By morning, the fire had dwindled. He stood, bones protesting, and added more wood. Then, careful not to wake her, he poured water into the basin and left it by her side with a small bar of soap. No instructions, no noise, just what she might need. Then he stepped outside. Cold air slapped his face. He breathed deep, long, like drawing it in might cleanse whatever had shifted overnight. Samuel Hartley was a man used to war, to graves, to absence. But now there was a girl in his cabin, and her quiet had changed the kind he knew. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she came from, or why the river had tried to take her. But he knew this: she was alive, and she was here. And that was enough, for now. By the second morning, the cabin no longer felt quite so hollow. Samuel had returned from checking the cattle line when he noticed the blanket folded differently on the cot, neater, tucked. His shirt, the one he'd left beside her, was no longer draped over the chair. She wore it now, loose on her frame, sleeves rolled clumsily. Her hair was tied back with a strip torn from the edge of her old dress. She didn't speak when he stepped inside, just looked at him, still and straight, eyes dark as flint. She stood barefoot near the hearth, a tin cup in her hands, steam rising. She had boiled water. Samuel nodded once. She didn't nod back, but she didn't look away either. He set down his coat, poured feed for the old mule outside, then returned to the quiet rhythm of the room. The way one does with storms, they pass or they stay. Either way, you learn to move with them. That day passed in gestures. She swept the floor using the old broom he hadn't touched in months, set the plates to dry near the window, pulled her blanket and cot closer to the fire when the temperature dropped. Not once did she ask permission. Samuel made no objections. When he ladled stew into 2 bowls that evening, he placed hers on the small table. Then, without comment, fetched a second spoon. She waited a breath before joining him. Sat at the edge, not quite across from him, diagonal, cautious, still close enough for the light to fall on her face. They ate in silence, not the kind that smothered, the kind that listened. Once she lifted her eyes, just briefly, long enough to meet his gaze and let it linger half a heartbeat longer than before. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was less fear. After supper, Samuel stood, rinsed the dishes, and found her watching. She didn't offer to help, but as he dried his hands, he heard the scrape of her chair and the quiet rustle as she pulled the blanket over her shoulders and sat again by the fire, just a few inches closer to where he'd soon rest. He didn't speak. She hadn't either, but the room felt fuller, warmer. Later, as the wind pressed against the window panes and night settled thick over the hills, Samuel lay awake, listening. Her breathing was steady now. Not labored, not frightened. He closed his eyes, one arm under his head. There were no words between them. But in her sweeping, in the boiled water, in the bowl she hadn't refused, Samuel recognized something old and sacred, a choice to remain. And sometimes that was louder than any vow spoken. That night, Samuel woke to a strange sound, the kind that wasn't danger, but wasn't nothing either. It was soft, like fabric shifting against wood, a breath drawn with hesitation. He turned his head just enough to see her. Naira had moved from her cot. She now lay on the rug by the fire, not quite beside him, not quite apart. Wrapped in her blanket, her knees drawn in, her back to his. The space between them was only a few feet wide enough to honor fear, narrow enough to suggest it was beginning to loosen its grip. He didn't move, didn't speak. Only the fire moved, casting shadows that flickered across the walls like memories neither of them could shake. The next night, the same, except she came earlier. He'd just finished stacking more wood when he heard the soft creak of floorboards. No footsteps, just presence. She settled again, this time parallel to him. Still not touching, but closer. The way someone sits near a stream to listen, not drink. By the fourth night, her shoulder brushed his. It was slight, could have been the blanket slipping. But when he stirred, she didn't pull away. Samuel lay there, still as prayer. The firelight played on the ceiling. He could hear her breathing, steady, slower now, and something in that sound grounded him more than anything had in years. There had been women before, years ago, when laughter still felt easy, when hands had purpose beyond work and pain. But none of those memories came with warmth. They were facts, not feeling. This was different. It wasn't lust. It wasn't comfort either. It was presence. Mutual, quiet, chosen. The night air turned colder. He reached out, not to hold, just to adjust the edge of her blanket. But her hand found his halfway. No words, just skin to skin, a light grip. She didn't let go, nor did he. They fell asleep like that, hands touching, barely, but it was more than enough. When morning came, neither mentioned it. Naira rose, tied her hair, fed the chickens. Samuel gathered firewood and repaired the latch on the stable door. But later, when she set his plate down at lunch, she didn't look away. He nodded, and for the first time since she came, she nodded back. If their bodies had begun to share space, now their spirits were beginning to lean, gently, toward one another. Not for safety, not from duty, but because something unspoken, sacred, had begun to take root between silence and firelight, something like trust and maybe even love. The storm rolled in just after dusk, thick clouds, sharp wind, and the low rumble of thunder that shook the floorboards before the rain even fell. Samuel moved through the cabin, latching windows, checking the roof for leaks he already knew were there. Naira had brought the chickens inside the coop earlier. Now she stood by the hearth, fingers tense around the clay mug of broth she hadn't touched. He saw it then, her eyes. Not fear of the storm, but of something beneath it, something old, a memory. She flinched at the first crack of thunder, just slightly, but enough. Samuel didn't say anything, just lit the lantern and moved slower, more deliberately, as if making noise might break something too fragile to name. That night, as rain pounded the roof like horses in retreat, he woke to a sound unlike the storm, a whisper, choked, in a language he didn't understand. He sat up. Naira was curled in the corner, near the door, not the fire. Blanket clutched to her chest. Her breath came fast and shallow. A nightmare, he realized. She didn't wake, even as he stepped closer. Didn't hear him until he knelt down, careful not to touch her. Her eyes opened wide, wild for a moment. Then recognition came, slow, painful. She didn't cry, but her shoulders told the story. Samuel didn't ask. He didn't need to know what she'd seen, only that she had survived it. He stood, fetched the tin cup, filled it with warm water, and placed it beside her. Then he sat down, not too close, but near enough for her to feel his presence like a wall against the storm. After a while she took the cup, drank slowly. Her hands still trembled. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached behind him, unbuckled the old leather holster he rarely removed, and set it aside. A gesture she watched closely. Then, deliberately, he rolled up the cuff of his left trouser leg. The scar was jagged, pale, thick, twisted around his knee like a map drawn in war. He let her look, let her see it for what it was, a memory he still carried, but no longer hid. Her eyes met his, and in that glance something shifted. Not sympathy, not pity, but understanding. By dawn, the storm had passed. She was asleep near the fire again, face turned toward him. And when he woke, her hand rested just inches from his. No words had passed between them. But that night, two kinds of pain had spoken, and both had been answered not with questions, but presence.
The evening was clear after 3 days of rain, and for the first time in weeks, the stars came out without apology. Samuel had pulled 2 chairs to the porch, more out of habit than invitation. He didn't expect her to follow, but she did. Barefoot, wrapped in the old wool shawl he'd left on the hook by the door. She moved quietly, her presence like a breeze, felt before it was heard. They sat in silence. The night was deep, full of desert stillness. No coyotes, no wind, just the hum of crickets and the rare blessing of calm. On the small table between them sat his Bible, faded, leather cracked, pages yellowing.
He hadn't opened it since the day they lowered Anna and Ruth into the earth. That morning his hand had trembled on the scripture. That evening he'd set it down, spine up, and turned away. Now, without thinking, he opened it. The page was Psalms. Familiar, aching words stared back at him, about valleys of shadow and the rod and the staff. Words he hadn't dared believe in for a long while. He didn't read them aloud. Instead, he turned the book gently, laid it flat so she could see, then leaned back. Naira didn't speak. She stared at the text, unmoving, then slowly reached forward. Her finger touched a passage, not to point, but to linger. Then she turned the page. Just once, just enough to say, "I see it." After a long silence, she whispered, "My mother used to hum this." Her voice was low, cracked, but clear. Samuel didn't move. "That line," she added, pointing, "even in the wilderness, he walks with us." He looked at her, long and quiet. "You know it?" he asked. She nodded. Not the words, the meaning. There was no sermon that followed, no revival in the dust.
Just 2 people, sitting side by side, the stars wide above them, and between them a book neither had touched in years, but both still somehow carried. Later that night, inside, Naira traced her fingers along the window pane. He watched from the chair, boots off, shirt open at the collar. She turned and spoke again. "You stopped believing?" He answered without hesitation. "No, I just stopped expecting." She nodded once, then said, softer than before, "Maybe belief finds us again." He didn't reply, but when he stood, he added another log to the fire, and this time, when he sat back down, it was beside her, not across. In the hush that followed, neither of them spoke again. But something in the room changed. A presence larger than grief, older than loss, something holy yet quiet, like grace making its way home. The morning arrived too quiet. Samuel knew the signs: birds missing from the sky, the mule restless, wind carrying more than just air. He stood on the porch with his rifle across his chest, eyes scanning the horizon. Then he saw them, 6 riders, approaching from the south ridge. Not military, not settlers, Apache. They rode slow, not in threat, but with purpose. The one in front wore a headdress marked with alternating feathers, red and white, a mark of age, of authority. Samuel stepped down, boots crunching gravel. Behind him the cabin door opened. Naira appeared. She didn't flinch, didn't run, just stood beside him, still in her worn shawl, her fingers tightening at her sides. The riders stopped 10 paces away, no weapons drawn. The elder dismounted. His eyes met Naira's first. Then he spoke, measured, in Apache. She responded, voice steady. Samuel waited, didn't interrupt. He watched her face, focused, unreadable. Finally, she turned to him. "This is my mother's uncle. He is the one who gave me my name." The old man stepped forward, hands open, voice grave. Naira translated. He says, "The law of our people is clear. A man who saves a woman from death becomes her protector, her family, if she chooses." Samuel's brow furrowed. "I don't own her," he said quietly. Naira translated. The elder paused, then replied. She turned back.
He says, "That is good. Protection is not ownership, but honor demands we recognize what has begun." Samuel looked at her. "And what do you want?" She didn't look at her uncle. She didn't glance away.
"I already chose," she said, "the moment I stayed." Behind them, the wind shifted. The elder nodded once, solemn. Then he stepped back, mounted his horse, and the group turned without further word. As they rode away, Samuel exhaled. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something he couldn't quite name. Commitment, maybe, or courage. Inside, the cabin hadn't changed, but everything inside them had. Later, as Samuel washed the stew pot, he noticed something he hadn't before. Naira had placed a second cup beside his at the table. Not because he asked, but because she knew she belonged. And he knew, finally, that he wanted her there. Not from obligation, not from ancient law, but from a quiet vow they'd both lived before ever speaking it aloud. "I choose you, even when the world watches." If their quiet bond touched your heart, imagine what they'll face when the world knocks on their door. Like and subscribe, because the strongest love must sometimes stand its ground. Snow had fallen in the night, not thick, but enough to powder the cabin roof and soften the dirt into silence.
Samuel stood by the window, mug of coffee cooling in his hands, when the first shadow broke the line of the horizon. Riders, 6 of them. They moved in a slow arc across the open field, dark shapes against white dust, horses breathing steam into the cold morning air. At their head rode a man draped in a robe of dark buckskin, his headdress marked by alternating red and white feathers. A single string of beads swayed at his chest, catching the faint morning light. Samuel didn't move. He set the mug down, reached for the rifle, but paused. No fear stirred in him, just a quiet, heavy sense that something long buried was rising. The door opened behind him. Naira stepped beside him, barefoot, wrapped in her wool shawl. Her eyes met the rider's and did not blink. She whispered, "That is my mother's uncle." Samuel looked down at her, then back at the riders. "Should I be worried?" She didn't answer. When the men arrived, they dismounted in unison, fluid, quiet, as if even their steps were part of some ritual. The elder approached, stopping 10 paces away. He raised no hand, drew no weapon. He spoke in Apache. The words were deep, round with age, but carried strength. Naira stepped forward, voice clear despite the chill. "He says, 'You saved me from death. By our law, that makes you protector, family, if I say yes.'" Samuel's jaw tightened slightly. He glanced from the old man to Naira. "And if I say no?" She paused, translated. The elder tilted his head, then responded. Naira turned back. "He says, 'She is not yours, not a prize. But a bond begins when one gives life back to another. And if she stays, then the law calls her yours to protect, not to own.'" Samuel let the silence sit between them for a moment. Then he said, low and steady, "I don't want to own her." The old man listened through Naira. Then he replied with a single nod. "No one owns fire," Naira said, "but it still warms the ones who carry it well." Samuel met her gaze. The snow began to fall again, slow and soft as ash. But in that moment, the air between them burned bright and unspoken. Because what had come wasn't a threat. It was a reckoning. And now the choice would have to be made. The elder's voice was low, like wind over dry stone. He stepped forward, closer now, close enough that Samuel could see the deep lines etched into his face like the canyons beyond the ridge. He spoke again. Naira listened in silence, eyes fixed not on the elder but on Samuel. "He says," she began, "the old ways are clear. When a man pulls someone from death's river, he does not just save a life, he takes responsibility for it. Samuel's brow furrowed. Responsibility how? She didn't answer immediately. The elder added something more, his tone firmer now. Naira translated, slower this time. If she stays with you and something happens, then it is not the world's burden, it is yours. Her life is now tied to yours. That is the cost of protection. Samuel looked away for a moment, let the words settle. And if she leaves, he asked. The elder didn't answer that one directly. He turned to Naira, spoke shorter this time. Her voice dropped as she relayed. If I choose not to stay, then he takes me back to the people. That is the way. Samuel exhaled through his nose. He looked at her then, really looked. Not at her face, but into it. Not the girl who had come half-drowned and bleeding, not the silent presence beside his fire, but the woman who stood here now, solid, grounded, burning with something deeper than fear. He turned to the elder, slow and deliberate.
I did not pull her from that river to own her, Samuel said. I did it because I could not let her drown. He paused, added softly, and I will not hold her now if she wants to go. Naira translated. The elder listened, then spoke a final sentence, short, firm, final. Naira turned, face unreadable. He says, then the choice is mine. The wind picked up. Somewhere in the trees, a bird shrieked once and went quiet. And for a moment, everything held still. The snow, the air, the men, even time itself. This was no longer about law. This was about her voice, her will. The elder stepped back, gave no command. He had brought the law, but left the decision in her hands. Now all eyes turned to Naira, and the world waited, not for a judgment, but for a whisper that would shape everything next. Naira didn't move at first. Her eyes scanned the snow-covered earth beneath her bare feet, as if the answer might be carved there, hidden in the hush. The riders stood in silence behind the elder, stoic, unreadable. Samuel remained still, his hands open, empty by his sides. No one pressured her. No voice rose to call her back. No gaze from her kin bore down in command. The weight pressing on her chest was not theirs, it was her own. She stepped forward, one foot, then another. Samuel watched as she closed the space between them, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had walked storms alone. She stopped before him, eyes level with his. I've seen death, she said softly, felt it in my bones, smelled it in the rivers. He didn't interrupt. I thought I was meant to disappear, to drift like smoke into nothing, until you pulled me out. She looked over her shoulder, briefly, at the elder, at the men on horseback, at the path back to the world that once called her blood. Then she turned fully to Samuel. I will not go back, she said. He opened her mouth, but she raised a hand gently. Not because of law, not because of what they say you owe me or I owe you. She placed her hand on his chest, just above the scar left from a bullet long ago. I choose you, she said. Her voice didn't tremble. Because here, she whispered, pressing her palm slightly, this place in you, it called to the place in me that had nothing left, and it answered. Behind them, the elder gave a low nod. He said nothing further. His eyes, once sharp, now softened with a strange kind of peace, like he had not lost something, but seen something returned to the earth he came from. He mounted without command. The others followed. Within moments, the sound of hooves faded into the white hush of morning. Samuel and Naira stood alone again. But the silence wasn't what it had been. It was filled with something now, like the hush after prayer or the first breath of spring. He reached out, took her hand, didn't speak. He didn't need to, because in that touch they had both spoken vows no law could write. A covenant of ashes and snow, loss and light, and love that answered only to choice. That night Samuel sat alone on the porch long after the wind had stilled. The snowfall had ceased, but the air was thick with a kind of stillness that reached beyond the cold. A silence not of weather, but of reckoning. Inside, he could hear Naira moving gently in the cabin, stoking the fire, folding blankets. But out here, beneath the dark canopy of stars, he let his thoughts rise like smoke. He remembered his father's voice years ago, after his mother died.
"The Lord doesn't always send angels in white robes," his father had said, "eyes hollow, but voice sure. Sometimes he sends us what we need dressed in dirt and blood and silence, and if we're too proud, we miss the grace." At the time, Samuel hadn't listened. He had buried that lesson in the same ground where they laid his wife and daughter years later. And then the war had come, and then the silence, and then this land, wide and empty enough for a man to disappear in. Until her, a girl half dead in a river, a stranger from a world foreign to his own. And yet her presence had cut through every scar he'd thought permanent. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, folded tight, worn thin, the flag from his daughter's coffin. He hadn't unfolded it in years, didn't even remember why he still kept it. But tonight he did. Not out of mourning, but because for the first time the silence wasn't about what had been lost. It was about what might now be possible. Inside, the fire crackled softly. He looked toward the doorway, toward the faint glow of lamplight spilling out onto snow. And he whispered, not a prayer, not exactly, but close. "Thank you," he said, simple, quiet. No thunder in the heavens, just a man, broken and stitched together by the presence of someone who'd seen the same darkness and still chosen light. He stood, brushing snow from his knees. When he stepped inside, Naira looked up from the fire. No words passed between them. He walked to the shelf and, for the first time in years, placed the folded flag not back in his coat, but on the mantel beside the Bible. Not because he'd found religion again, but because he'd remembered something deeper. Faith is not what you carry in your hand. It's who you choose to walk beside when the storm hasn't passed. The next morning, the cabin was quiet, not with awkwardness, but with a kind of sacred calm, like the stillness of a church after the last hymn has faded. Samuel rose early. He didn't speak, didn't pause to reflect. He simply did what needed doing. He took the second chair, the one that had always sat in the corner, unused, covered in dust, and pulled it to the table. Not with flourish, not with ceremony. He wiped it clean with a rag, set it across from his own, then stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. 2 chairs, 2 places, no longer just his. Outside, the morning sun was weak but present, spilling over the frost-covered grass in a slow, golden crawl. Naira came in from gathering water. Her hair was damp with mist, cheeks red from the chill. She paused when she saw the table. She didn't smile, didn't need to. Instead, she walked to the pegs on the wall, took down one of Samuel's old coats, frayed at the cuffs, torn at the elbow, and sat by the hearth. Needle in hand, she began to mend it, quietly, carefully. Each stitch was deliberate. She didn't ask permission. She didn't ask if he'd wear it again. She simply fixed it. Because it mattered, because it belonged, because he belonged, not to her, but with her. Later that day, as he worked the fence line, he glanced back at the cabin.
smoke curling from the chimney, curtains drawn. And on the porch rail, that coat now hung beside hers, mended, aired out, waiting. He stared at it a while, then smiled. No vows had been exchanged, no rings, no preacher's blessin' or tribe's declaration. But here was the truth. He had made space for her in his home. She had made space for him in her hands. And that was enough. That night they ate in silence, 2 bowls steaming between them. After the meal, Naira rose to wash the dishes, and Samuel stood beside her, not to help, just to be near. At one point she reached out, handed him a cloth. Their fingers brushed, and in that single passing touch was all the promise they needed. Because love, real love, is not always loud. It does not always announce itself. Sometimes it's just a chair pulled close, a coat mended, a fire tended together. And in that, they had chosen each other again. 2 days later, before sunrise, Samuel heard the sound of hooves again. He stood at the window, heart steady this time. But it wasn't a troop, just one horse. Atop it sat the old Apache elder. No warriors, no weapons, just him. Samuel stepped outside without his rifle. Naira followed, silent as ever, shawl pulled close. They stood side by side again, but now the air between them was different, settled, rooted. The elder dismounted slowly. He approached, looked at them both. Then from the small pouch at his side he drew out a string of beads, smooth river stones and carved wood, woven with aged sinew. He held it out, not to Samuel, not to Naira, but between them, a gift, not a decree. Naira took it, bowed her head slightly. "He says," she translated, "this is not a binding, it is a blessing, a symbol, from the elders, from the land." Samuel nodded once. "Tell him thank you." But the elder had already turned. He mounted with ease belying his age, gave them a single look over his shoulder, and then rode away into the waking light. As he disappeared into the horizon, Naira looked down at the beads in her hand. She didn't tie them, she didn't place them on a shelf. Instead, she walked to the porch rail where the 2 coats still hung side by side, and she hung the beads between them. No words were spoken, they didn't need to be. Later, they sat on that same porch, just the 2 of them. Her feet tucked beneath her, his hand wrapped around a mug. The sun rose slowly over the Gila River, casting long light through the canyon. Samuel glanced over. "You all right?" Naira nodded. "It feels like peace." He didn't answer, just smiled. And after a while she said, "I don't belong to white law or to tribal rule, not anymore." She looked at him. "I belong here because I chose here." He reached for her hand, held it firm and warm. They watched the world turn gold around them. The river shimmered below. The land didn't claim them, it welcomed them. Because home is not where you're from, it's where someone stays, when they have every right to leave. And in that quiet light, beneath a sky that no longer held judgment, just promise, they became a family. Not by ceremony, not by blood, but by the one thing that outlives all war and law. Grace freely given and love freely received. One choice, one fire-lit silence, and a love that no law can define. If you believe in the power of quiet courage, subscribe us into the stillness that heals. The earth had softened. Where frost once held the ground in a tight fist, now it yielded beneath their hands, moist, dark, alive. Morning light crept through the cottonwoods, dusting the field with golden mist. The river murmured nearby, lazy and full from winter's melt. Samuel knelt by the furrowed soil, sleeves rolled, calloused hands steady, as he broke clumps apart with his fingers. Naira moved beside him. Her long skirt brushed against the turned earth. She carried a small satchel sewn from old cloth, the one she'd embroidered with tiny stars the week before. In it, pumpkin seeds, dry and flat, but full of promise. She knelt, dug gently, placed the seeds into the cradles he had made. It was quiet, not heavy, just still, like a prayer whispered through the dirt. They worked side by side until the last row was done. Then she paused, fingers resting lightly over her belly. Samuel looked over. She didn't say anything at first, just held her hand there, still and calm, as if listening for something deep inside. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "You know already?" Naira met his gaze. No smile, no dramatics, just the softest nod. "I know." She didn't speak of plans, no cradle building, no names. Just that quiet certainty between two people who had walked through fire and found green earth again. Samuel didn't move closer, didn't touch her. But in that moment, his presence folded around her like a second skin. They sat back on their heels, eyes following a hawk overhead. And in that silence, the world breathed a little easier. Later, they carried water to the field, covered the seeds, marked the rows with cedar sticks. No words, just rhythm. Evening came slow. Light faded gold into blue. As they stepped back inside the cabin, Naira paused at the door, glanced over her shoulder one last time. The rows of soil behind them were dark, almost invisible now in the dusk. But beneath it, life stirred. Unseen, unannounced, but certain. The wind carried the scent of river sage and mesquite smoke as the day faded. They sat on the porch, her chair pulled close to his, not quite touching. Naira cradled a mug of chamomile, steam curling around her fingers. Samuel leaned back, boots crossed at the ankles, his hat tilted over one knee. The silence was easy now, familiar. It no longer asked questions or demanded answers. She watched a bird hop along the rail. Then, softly, without turning, she said, "I don't belong to white law, or Apache law." Her words settled like ash in the air, gentle but irrevocable. "I used to think I had to choose, one side or the other, speak one tongue, walk one road." She turned to him then, eyes steady. "But I choose this cabin, this quiet, you." Samuel looked at her, not startled, not triumphant, just seen. He didn't answer right away, didn't make promises. He simply stood, walked inside, and came back with something folded in his hand. He placed it gently on the table beside her. A cloth napkin, 2 wooden spoons, and an old ceramic plate, cracked but clean. 2 place settings. Naira stared. He didn't explain. Just poured water into her cup, then his. Set the spoons beside each mug, then sat, as if they'd been doing this for years. And maybe, in some quiet way, they had. Later, when dusk turned the canyon walls indigo and the crickets started their evening hymn, she reached out and took his hand. No vows were spoken, no rings exchanged, just fingers curling into one another, not as proof, but as presence. And in that moment, the line between what was hers, what was his, and what was theirs vanished. Not by law, not by tradition, but by something older, something quieter, like trust, handed down in silence. The snow returned one evening, soft, slow, as if it had forgotten how to be cruel. Outside, the world was hushed. Cottonwoods stood still, their bare limbs outlined in pale light. Smoke rose from the chimney in lazy curls, warming the bones of the old cabin where 2 people slept. Inside, the lamp burned low. Faint orange light flickered on the wooden walls, catching the edge of the Bible still resting on the shelf, unopened yet never removed. Samuel lay awake. Naira was beside him, curled toward the fire,
her breath even, her hand resting gently where life stirred beneath her skin. He watched her in the dimness, the shape of her back, the rhythm of her chest. He could feel her warmth, steady and real, not imagined, not hoped for, real. And for a long time he just lay there, listening to the wind against the cabin, remembering. He remembered the river, the shock of cold, the weight of her limp body, the way her skin had looked against the stones, gray and nearly gone. And then he looked now. Warmth had returned to her, color, purpose. She had brought those things to him, too, not with speeches, not with salvation, but by staying. He turned his face toward the roof. A few stray flakes slipped in through a crack in the shutters, floating like ashes. He reached for her hand, careful not to wake her. His fingers found hers easily, like roots seeking one another underground. No rings, no paper, no pastor, just this. Her breath in the dark, his hand over hers, and the quiet. He thought of something his father once said, words buried deep and long forgotten, but now stirring like embers. Sometimes God doesn't send angels.
Sometimes he sends someone who just needs a place to stay. And if you open the door, maybe you both get saved. Samuel closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because he'd found rest. And as the snow whispered down over the roof, over the canyon, over everything they used to be, he knew. They didn't belong to law, to war, to loss. They belonged here, to this home, to this quiet, to each other, not by duty, but by choice. If this story stirred something deep within you, don't stop here. Follow our Western Love Stories series, where every tale carries the scent of old wood, the echo of distant bells, and hearts quietly healing. Let your soul linger where love grows in silence and memories ride the wind. If you like this video, comment number 1. If you don't, comment number 2. Please subscribe to the channel to watch more videos and give me more motivation to collect and share other stories.